Single mother takes her twins to a job interview for a cleaning position at a billionaire's mansion. But once they arrive, the kids do something that leaves everyone in shock. The alarm clock rang at 5 in the morning, as always. Anne opened her eyes in the dark and silenced it before it could wake the boys. Just 5 more minutes, she thought, while her body begged for more rest. But Anne didn't have the luxury of time. 5 fewer minutes meant less money at the end of the day. Oh no, oh no, oh no. She jumped out of bed when she checked the clock again. Those 5 minutes had turned into 20. She ran to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to chase away the fatigue. The twins' breakfast was already prepared from the night before, simple peanut butter sandwiches. She left 2 colorful notes next to the plates. Be good for Mrs. Porter. Love you, Mom. The neighbor watched the boys when Anne worked her early cleaning shifts. That was when her phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but Anne answered anyway. Every call could be a work opportunity. Hello? The voice on the other end was deep, formal. Am I speaking with Anne Walsh? Yes, this is she. This is Alice Grant from the Carter Mansion. I received your resume for the permanent cleaning position. Anne's heart skipped a beat. This was the job she'd been waiting for weeks. A steady position, a guaranteed monthly salary, health insurance for the boys. Yes, of course. I'm very interested. Anne tried to contain the excitement in her voice. Mr. Carter would like to interview you today at 10 in the morning. Would that be possible? Anne froze. Mrs. Porter had warned she couldn't watch the twins today. Her mind raced through the possibilities. There was no one else who could stay with the boys, and she couldn't miss this interview. I'll be there, she replied, trying not to sound desperate. May I ask, would it be a problem if I brought my children? They're 5-year-old twins. I promise they behave well. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It's not the standard procedure, Alice replied hesitantly, but since it's just for the interview, I'll make an exception. Mr. Carter is very particular about his routine. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll be there promptly at 10. Anne hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She looked down the hallway toward the twins' bedroom. She needed to wake them, get them ready, and make sure they understood how important this day was. The bus was late, as always. Anne held Ethan's hand tightly in her right hand and Liam's in her left, checking her watch every minute. Mom, are we going to be late? Ethan asked, looking at the cloudy sky. No, honey. We'll be right on time, Anne lied, knowing they were already at least 10 minutes behind schedule. The bus appeared at the corner, and she sighed in relief. During the ride, she explained to the boys how important the interview was. You both need to stay very quiet while I talk to the man in the big house, okay? No running, no shouting, no touching anything. Like in the library, Liam asked. Exactly like in the library, but even quieter. The twins nodded, their green eyes, identical to their father's, shining with the seriousness of the mission. Anne felt a pang in her chest. Ever since Mike left 3 years ago, the boys had to grow up too quickly. When they got off the bus, the Carter Mansion was already visible in the distance, atop the hill that dominated this remote part of town. It was an imposing building with tall windows and stone walls, like something out of a storybook. Minus the charm, just a cold, distant grandeur. Mom, is that house owned by a king? Liam squeezed her hand. No, sweetheart. It belongs to a man named Mr. Carter. He needs someone to clean the house, and I'm trying to get that job. That's a huge house to clean alone, Ethan observed. Always practical. Anne swallowed hard. Yes, it's really big. When they finally reached the gate, a security guard eyed them with suspicion. Anne explained about the interview, and after a quick check over the radio, they were allowed in. The path through the property felt endless. A meticulously maintained garden stretched in all directions, but without colorful flowers, only perfectly trimmed bushes in precise geometric shapes. It was beautiful, but lifeless. Mom, where are the flowers? Liam asked, looking around. Maybe in the back of the house, Anne said, though she doubted it. When they finally reached the main entrance, the door opened before they could ring the bell. A tall woman, her gray hair in a flawless bun, greeted them with a critical gaze. "Ms. Walsh, I'm Alice Grant, the housekeeper. We were expecting you at 10 o'clock. Anne checked her watch. 10:15. "I'm sorry I'm late. The bus—" "Mr. Carter values punctuality," Alice interrupted, but her gaze softened a bit when she saw the twins. "These must be your children." "Yes, Ethan and Liam. Boys, say hello to Mrs. Grant." "Hello," they said in unison, their small voices echoing in the huge entrance hall. Alice waved them inside briefly. "You can wait in the living room. Mr. Carter will be with you in a few minutes. Please make sure the children don't touch anything." Anne nodded, leading the twins into the indicated room. The mansion's interior was even more impressive than its exterior, and just as cold. Antique furniture, probably very expensive, stood out against walls painted in neutral tones. Everything was immaculate, as though no one actually lived there. "It looks like a museum," Anne whispered to herself. The living room was dominated by a marble fireplace, unlit despite the chilly air that filled the space. Somber landscape paintings decorated the walls, and a large window offered a view of the gardens. Anne sat on the very edge of a leather sofa, afraid to crease it, placing the twins beside her. "Remember what we talked about? Super quiet like in the library." The minutes dragged on. Anne mentally reviewed all the possible questions they might ask, all the answers she should give. She desperately needed this job. That was when she noticed the silence. Ethan, Liam. The twins were no longer by her side. Anne jumped up, panic rising in her chest. She looked around the room. Nothing. She approached the door, peering into the hallway. No sign of them. "Ethan, Liam," she called out, trying not to shout, but loud enough for them to hear. She headed down the hallway, each second making her more anxious. How would she explain to Alice, or worse, to Mr. Carter, that she had lost her children inside the mansion in less than 10 minutes? Then she heard them. Small voices coming from a room at the end of the corridor. Anne ran, her heart pounding, and stopped abruptly at the threshold of a large office. There were her sons, but they weren't alone. A tall man in a perfectly tailored dark suit stood before them. His face, and with sharp lines and cold eyes, embodied authority. Thomas Carter, without a doubt. Anne was about to apologize when she heard Liam say, "Mister, you look sad. Want a hug?" Time seemed to freeze. Mr. Carter's expression first registered surprise, then discomfort, and then something Anne couldn't quite read. For a moment, it looked like the man had been hit by something invisible. "Don't need hugs," he finally replied, his voice rough as if it wasn't used often. "Everybody needs hugs," Ethan insisted, taking a step forward. "Mom says hugs are medicine for sadness." Anne finally found her voice. "Ethan! Liam! Come here right now!" 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. The twins looked confused, not understanding what they had done wrong. Mr. Carter, on the other hand, watched her with an unreadable expression. "Ms. Walsh, I presume," he said. "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry for the intrusion. I just left the boys for a moment and—" "So these are your children?" It wasn't a question, but Anne answered anyway. "Yes, sir. Ethan and Liam. They just turned 5. Thomas Carter studied the twins for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to Anne. "Mrs. Grant informed me you're here for the cleaning position." "Yes, sir. And these are your children." He repeated the statement, as if trying to fit an out-of-place puzzle piece into his organized world. "Yes. I'm sorry I had to bring them, but I had no one to watch them today. Usually they stay with a neighbor while I work, but she couldn't today. I promise that if I get the job, I'll find a permanent solution." Thomas Carter crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the room as though assessing invisible damage. The mansion has 14 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 living rooms, and a library. The gardens are maintained by an external team, but all internal areas are the responsibility of the housekeeper. The job is Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. Do you have experience with properties of this scale? The sudden shift to practical details caught Anne off guard. "I worked in hotels for 3 years and then in private homes. Never in a house this large, but I learn fast and I'm very organized." Thomas nodded slightly. "References?" "I have them with me." Anne opened her purse, searching for the folder containing recommendation letters from previous employers. Her fingers trembled slightly. While she searched, Thomas turned his attention back to the twins, who stood quietly by her side. Liam watched him with curious eyes, while Ethan seemed more interested in the books lining the shelves. Here it is. Anne held out the folder. Thomas took it but didn't open it. That won't be necessary, you're hired. Anne blinked, sure she had misheard. Excuse me. You're hired, Mrs. Walsh. You can start on Monday. At that moment, Alice Grant appeared at the door, looking surprised to see her employer in his private office with the visitors. Mr. Carter, you should have called me. I would have. Mrs. Walsh will start on Monday. Please prepare all the necessary paperwork. Alice looked momentarily taken aback, but soon regained her professional composure. Yes, sir. Ms. Walsh. If you'll come with me so we can discuss the details. Anne remained frozen, still processing what had just happened. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thomas had already turned back to his desk, as if the conversation were over. But before Anne could leave with the twins, he spoke again, still not turning around. Your children, do they attend school? Yes, sir, in the afternoon. Then they won't be a problem during work hours. No, sir. I have a neighbor who takes them to school and stays with them until I return. Thomas made a dismissive gesture with his hand, and Anne understood that their audience was over. She took the twins' hands and followed Alice out of the office. As they walked down the hallway, the housekeeper explained details about the salary and benefits, more than Anne had expected, far more than she'd been earning in the temporary jobs she'd been taking. Mr. Carter rarely hires someone so quickly, Alice commented, curiosity in her voice. Actually, I've never seen him hire anyone without checking references or doing a trial period. Anne looked back toward the office. I guess I was lucky. Alice followed her gaze. Maybe. Or maybe your children said something no one else has had the courage to say in the last 3 years. Anne didn't ask what the housekeeper meant by that. The kids walked ahead, admiring the paintings on the walls, oblivious to the impact their innocent words had caused. The journey home felt shorter. The twins ran ahead, playing tag on the sidewalk, while Anne walked behind them, lost in thought. Mom, are you going to work in that big house? Liam asked, coming back to hold her hand. I will, sweetie. Starting Monday. Is that sad man going to be your boss? Yes, Mr. Carter will be my boss. Ethan joined them on the other side. He looked sad, right, Liam? Liam nodded vigorously. Very sad, like Billy at school when he lost his puppy. Anne smiled, gently ruffling their hair. Some people look sad even when they're not. Maybe Mr. Carter is just serious. No, Liam insisted. He had sad eyes. You always say you can see sadness in people's eyes. Anne didn't respond. There was something in Thomas Carter's eyes, something beyond the coldness and authority, a pain that seemed buried long ago, but you could still see if you looked close enough. The bus arrived, and they boarded in silence. As the twins dozed off against her shoulders, worn out from the day's adventure, Anne looked out the window, watching the Carter mansion disappear in the distance. A steady job, good pay, health insurance, everything she'd been searching for months. She should feel relieved, even happy, But there was something about the Carter mansion, something about her new employer's expression when Liam offered him a hug, that made her uneasy. What am I getting myself into? She murmured, as the bus rumbled back toward the small apartment they called home. Anne knew the answer would come in time. For now, she could only be grateful for the opportunity and try not to dwell on the sadness in Thomas Carter's eyes. The weekend flew by too quickly. Anne spent every free moment organizing the logistics of her new routine. She talked to Mrs. Porter about taking the boys to school every day and staying with them until she returned. Money would be tight the first month, until she got her salary, but it would be worth it. On Monday morning, Anne woke up before her alarm. She got ready carefully, choosing simple but presentable clothes. She didn't want to look sloppy on her first day. Today's the big day, right, Mom? Ethan asked as they ate breakfast. Yes, honey. My first day at the new job. Are you going to see the sad man again? Liam asked between spoonfuls of cereal. Yes, Mr. Carter is my boss now, and remember, you can't come with me. You'll stay with Mrs. Porter, and then she'll take you to school. The twins nodded, though Anne noticed a hint of disappointment in Liam's eyes. He seemed intrigued by Thomas Carter. After dropping the kids off with the neighbor, Anne walked to the bus stop, her heart pounding. She couldn't deny she was nervous. Thomas Carter seemed like a demanding man, and the mansion was huge, but she had to succeed. For Ethan and Liam, for all she dreamed of giving them. When the bus stopped in front of the Carter property, Anne took a deep breath and got off, ready for her first day. The same security guard recognized her and waved her in without question. Alice was waiting at the main door, her expression serious but not unfriendly. "Good morning, Miss Walsh. Punctual, excellent." "Good morning, Mrs. Grant. I'm excited to start." The housekeeper nodded. "I'll show you the cleaning supplies and the areas you need to cover each day. Mr. Carter is very particular about certain details." Anne followed Alice through the mansion's corridors, listening attentively to her instructions. There were rules for everything, from which products to use on each type of surface to the order in which rooms should be cleaned. Mr. Carter usually works in his office until noon, so we leave that area for later. The West Wing is rarely used, but it still has to be kept impeccable. Mr. Carter inspects all areas regularly. For 2 hours, Anne absorbed information, trying to memorize every detail. The mansion was even bigger than it seemed, with hallways leading nowhere and rooms that felt frozen in time, as if no one had visited them in years. "And here's your uniform," Alice concluded, handing Anne a simple set of light grey pants and a matching top. "The staff changing room is at the end of this corridor. You can start with the dining room today." Anne thanked her and, after changing clothes, began her work. The huge dining room, with a table that could easily seat 20 people, looked like it had never been used. The chairs were perfectly lined up, and the polished surface of the table showed no sign of wear. As she meticulously cleaned every inch, Anne wondered what kind of life Thomas Carter led. He owned this enormous mansion, but from what she could see, he practically lived alone. Except for a few staff members, there were no family photos on the walls, no signs of life beyond the cold, calculated perfection of every object in its place. Around 11 chul, while polishing a set of silverware, Anne heard footsteps approaching. She stood up straight, her heart racing at the sound of Thomas Carter's firm steps. He appeared in the doorway, impeccable in his dark suit, studying her with those piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "Mrs. Walsh, good morning, Mr. Carter." Anne forced a smile, unsure how to act. Thomas looked around as if searching for any imperfections. "Alice said you're adapting well." "Yes, sir." Mrs. Grant was very clear with her instructions. He nodded slightly. "Your children, are they settled?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't expected Thomas Carter to remember, let alone care about her son's situation. "Yes, sir. They're with my neighbor, and then they go to school." "Good." Thomas seemed to have exhausted his quota of small talk. He turned to go, but paused in the doorway. "If you need anything, let Alice know." "Yes, sir." "Thank you." He left without a backward glance, leaving Anne with a strange feeling. On one hand, Thomas Carter was exactly as she expected, cold, distant, formal. On the other, he'd asked that question about the boys, as if, for a brief moment, he'd allowed a spark of humanity to peek through. "Curious," she murmured, returning to her work. The rest of the day went by in a blur of chores. The mansion demanded meticulous labor, and although Anne was used to intense cleaning jobs, by the end of the day every muscle in her body protested. When she finally finished and said goodbye to Alice, the sun was already beginning to set. Anne hurried to catch the bus, eager to see her kids and tell them about her first day. What she wouldn't tell them, however, was how she kept glancing at the mansion's shadows, waiting to catch another glimpse of that sadness in Thomas Carter's eyes, or how she couldn't stop thinking about his unexpected question about her children. Because something in her instincts told her that, behind that cold and distant facade, there was more to Thomas Carter than anyone at the mansion realized, and for some inexplicable reason, the twins had managed to find a crack in his armor. As the bus rumbled down the road, Anne looked out at the mansion in the distance, standing tall against the orange sky. A shiver ran through her. This job would change her life, she was sure of it. What she didn't know yet was that it would also change Thomas Carter's life, and that a simple offer of a hug by a 5-year-old boy had already set in motion something no one could predict. The first month at work passed more quickly than Anne had imagined. The routine at the Carter mansion soon established itself with almost mechanical predictability. At exactly 8, the guard opened the gate for her. By 8:05, Alice greeted her at the back door with a list of daily chores. And sometime between 9 and 10, Thomas Carter emerged from his room and locked himself in his office, rarely coming out before nightfall. It was a particularly cold Monday when Anne noticed something she had been ignoring since day one: the silence. Not just an absence of noise, something deeper and more unsettling. A silence that seemed to have been cultivated over the years, like a poisonous plant that grows slowly until it dominates an entire garden. While dusting the library shelves, her favorite room in the mansion, Anne stopped, holding her breath for a moment. Nothing. Not a clock ticking. Not the natural creaking of an old house. Not even the sound of wind at the windows. It was as if the mansion itself had forgotten how to breathe. "It's like a mausoleum," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely loud in the oppressive silence. Unlike other homes where she had worked, the Carter mansion had no radios playing in the kitchen, no TVs on in the living rooms, no sound of occupants hurrying back and forth. Even the few employees, the gardener who came 3 times a week, the rarely called driver, and Alice, seemed to have learned to move like ghosts, avoiding any unnecessary noise. Anne resumed her work, now aware of how the sound of the duster against the books echoed. A disquieting feeling grew in her chest. It wasn't exactly fear, it was more like sadness. A house so large, so beautiful, and so dead. She picked up her bucket of cleaning products and moved on to the next area on the list, a rarely used living room. The chairs were arranged perfectly, as if no one had ever sat in them. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces, despite the weekly cleaning. It was strange how a place so immaculate could still feel abandoned. As she cleaned the furniture, Anne studied the room's details. Paintings of austere landscapes hung on the walls, but there were no personal photographs, no objects suggesting the people who lived here. It was as if the mansion was just an empty shell, with no memories or stories. "You get used to it, you know." The voice made Anne jump, causing her to drop the wood polish she was holding. Alice stood in the doorway, her face expressionless as usual. "Used to what?" Anne asked, picking up the fallen bottle. "The silence." Alice entered the room, adjusting a vase that didn't really need adjusting. "At first, it's disturbing. After a while, you barely notice." Anne doubted she could ever get used to such stifling silence, but she said nothing. She continued working, aware that Alice was watching her with keen eyes. "This house wasn't always like this, you know," the housekeeper said suddenly, her voice softer than usual. "There was a time when it was full of life, laughter, activity." Anne looked up, surprised by the change in Alice's tone. "What changed?" Alice hesitated, as if gauging how far she should go. "It's not my place to discuss Mr. Carter's personal life. Just, he wasn't always like this, you know? The man you see now." Before Anne could ask more, Alice continued, "Mr. Carter has a meeting early tomorrow and won't be home. It would be a good time to clean his office." Anne nodded, recognizing the signal to end the conversation, but the revelation, vague though it was, stirred her curiosity. Thomas Carter used to be different. It was hard to imagine the cold, distant man she knew as anything else. Early the next morning, Anne arrived at the mansion to find that Thomas had already left, as Alice had said. The house felt even emptier without him there. It was strange how someone she barely saw could leave such a noticeable gap when absent. "Mr. Carter left instructions that nothing on his desk be moved," Alice warned as she unlocked the office door. "Just dust the furniture, clean the windows, and vacuum the rug." Anne nodded, stepping into the room she was rarely allowed to clean. Thomas's office was unlike the rest of the house. While other rooms seemed frozen in time, this space showed clear signs of daily use. Half-finished coffee on the desk, papers neatly stacked in piles, a coat draped over a chair's back, small indicators that someone actually lived here. She started with the windows, working methodically to avoid disturbing anything on the desk or shelves. The office overlooked the gardens, and Anne allowed herself a moment to admire the view. Even in winter, with the vegetation dormant, there was a stark beauty in the sculpted shrubs and stone pathways. As she finished cleaning the windows, she noticed something for the first time, a small shelf behind the desk, almost hidden between two filing cabinets. Unlike the rest of the office, which was impeccably organized, this shelf looked forgotten, with books stacked haphazardly and some picture frames. Anne approached, intrigued. She had no reason to look closely. It wasn't her job to check behind the desk, but something drew her in. Maybe it was the instinct to learn more about her mysterious employer. Running the duster across the frames, Anne allowed herself a quick glance. Most showed landscapes, mountains, beaches, places she'd never visited. But one frame in particular caught her eye. It was turned to face the wall, as if someone had deliberately hidden it. Anne knew she shouldn't. She knew she was violating Thomas's privacy. But her fingers seemed to have a will of their own as she carefully turned the frame around. The photo showed a radiant woman with wavy brown hair falling over her shoulders, smiling at the camera while holding a boy of about 4 in her arms. They stood in front of a carousel, and the boy had the same bright, genuine smile as his mother. Almost out of frame, behind them, was Thomas, and Anne barely recognized him. His face, usually stern and closed off, was relaxed in a smile that reached his eyes. He looked like a completely different person. Lost in thought, Anne didn't realize she was holding the frame less securely than she should have. When she turned to continue cleaning, her elbow hit the edge of the desk, and the frame slipped from her fingers. The sound of shattering glass against the hardwood floor was like a gunshot in the mansion's silence. Anne crouched down immediately, heart racing, trying to pick up the pieces. "What happened?" Thomas's voice came from the doorway, and Anne felt her blood run cold. He wasn't supposed to be home. Alice had said, "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. I was just cleaning and—" Her hands trembled as she gathered the shards. Thomas stepped into the office, and his gaze went straight to the photo now exposed, without its glass protection. His face, normally expressionless, changed. A cold, contained fury twisted his features. "What were you doing with that?" His voice, low and controlled, was more frightening than if he had screamed. "I was only cleaning, sir. The frame fell when—" It was turned to the wall. Thomas moved closer, taking the photo and what remained of the frame from Anne's hands. Deliberately turned. Anne stood up, feeling small under Thomas's simmering anger. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I didn't mean to—" "Get out, sir. I can clean this up and—" "Get out!" Anne recoiled, frightened. She had never heard him raise his voice, and the impact was like a slap. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and quickly left the office, still trembling. Behind her, she heard the sound of the door being locked. She leaned against the hallway wall, taking deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. Who were those people in the photo? And why had just seeing them provoked such a powerful reaction in Thomas? Alice appeared at the end of the corridor, drawn by the noise. Her gaze traveled from the locked office door to Anne's pale face. "Mr. Carter came back earlier," Anne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice nodded, understanding the situation without needing further explanation. "Come to the kitchen." Anne followed the housekeeper, still shaking slightly. While Alice prepared something warm to drink, Anne tried to process what had happened. "I dropped a picture frame," she finally confessed. "It had a photo of him, a woman and a little boy." Alice froze for a moment, her back to Anne. When she turned, her face showed an expression Anne had never seen, a mixture of sadness and compassion. "He wasn't always like this," said the housekeeper, repeating words she'd shared before, but now with deeper meaning. "Before the accident, Mr. Carter was a different man. The mansion was different." "Accident?" Anne asked. Alice placed a steaming mug in front of her. "It's not my place to tell that story, Mrs. Walsh. But know that what you saw today is only a fraction of the pain he carries." Anne sipped, letting the warmth calm her nerves. "I think he's going to fire me." "No, he won't," Alice said, sitting across from her. "Mr. Carter has his moments, but he's a fair man. Once he calms down, he'll realize it was an accident." "How can you be so sure?" Alice gave a sad smile. "I've worked for the Carters for almost 20 years. I've known Thomas since he was barely older than your twins." Anne lowered her eyes to the mug, feeling like an intruder into a story she didn't know, a pain she couldn't understand. "Finish your drink," Alice said, standing up. "Then you can go back to the library. I'll handle the office once Mr. Carter leaves." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Anne worked mechanically, still shaken by the morning's incident. She didn't see Thomas again. He stayed locked in his office until after her usual quitting time. At the end of her shift, she hesitated. Should she say goodbye, apologize again? She decided it was better to wait until the following day, when they'd both had time to process what had happened. The bus ride home had never felt so long. Anne was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. The image of that photo and Thomas's reaction wouldn't leave her mind. "Mom!" Ethan and Liam ran to her as soon as she opened the apartment door. "Look what we made today." The twins held out colorful drawings, their faces eager for approval. Anne forced a smile, trying to set aside the day's heaviness. "They're beautiful, my loves. Let's hang them on the fridge." As she made a simple dinner, Anne listened to the boys chatter about their day with Mrs. Porter. She tried to focus on their cheerful voices, but her mind kept drifting back to the mansion, the silence, the shattered photo, the furious look in Thomas's eyes. "Are you sad, Mom?" Liam asked suddenly, breaking her train of thought. Anne turned, surprised. "No, honey. Just a bit tired." "Is it because of the man in the big house?" the boy pressed, with that almost supernatural perception children sometimes have. "No, it's just—" Anne hesitated. How could she explain the day's complexity? "Mr. Carter was upset today, but it's nothing for you two to worry about." "So he's still sad," Liam concluded, returning to his coloring at the kitchen table. "He needs more hugs." Anne didn't answer. If there was one thing Thomas Carter didn't need, at least from her, it was hugs. He needed space and privacy, things she had inadvertently violated that day. Later, after the twins fell asleep, Anne sat on the small balcony of the apartment, looking at the city lights. The night was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one at the Carter mansion. This one was natural, dotted by distant city sounds. He wasn't always like that. Alice's words returned to her. What had happened to Thomas Carter? What tragedy had turned the smiling man in the photo into the cold, distant person she knew? And why did she care, despite everything? The next morning, Anne prepared for the worst. Maybe Thomas had left instructions with Alice to fire her, or maybe he would just ignore her completely, making the work environment even colder. To her surprise, when she arrived at the mansion, Alice greeted her with a neutral expression, almost relieved. "Mr. Carter left early," the housekeeper informed. "He asked me to tell you that yesterday's incident is forgotten." Anne blinked in disbelief. "He's not angry. Mr. Carter has his temper, but he recognizes an accident when he sees one." Alice smoothed her uniform, returning to her usual formality. "He asked that you continue your normal tasks, but leave the office for another day." Anne nodded, feeling immense relief. She hadn't been fired, and Thomas bore no grudge about the incident. It was more than she expected. The day went on as usual, but Anne felt different. The mansion's oppressive silence was still there, but she heard it differently now. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of a pain so deep it had swallowed all other noises. That afternoon, while tidying one of the rarely used guest rooms, Anne reflected on what had happened. Thomas's overblown reaction, Alice's mention of an accident, the hidden photo. It all pointed to a tragedy he was trying and failing to bury. Mrs. Porter had called mid-morning to say she wasn't feeling well and asked Anne to pick up the twins early. On any other day, this would have been a problem. But Anne remembered Alice's suggestion a few days ago, when she'd needed to bring the twins to the mansion for a few hours due to an emergency. "Mr. Carter wouldn't mind," the housekeeper had said, "as long as they stay in the kitchen and don't interfere with your work. That time, Thomas hadn't been at the mansion, but today, Anne wasn't sure it would be appropriate. Still, she had no choice. When she finished the guest room, she went down to talk to Alice. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, cooking something that smelled wonderful. "Alice, I need to pick up my twins early today. Mrs. Porter is unwell. Would it be a problem if they stayed here for a few hours while I finish my shift?" The housekeeper didn't seem surprised by the request. "Of course not, Ms. Walsh. Mr. Carter won't be home until the evening anyway, and even if he were, I doubt he'd mind." Anne wasn't so sure, especially after yesterday's incident, but she had no other option. "Thank you. I'll be back in an hour." When she returned with the twins, Anne set them up at the large kitchen table with paper and colored pencils that Alice provided. The boys, thrilled to visit the big house again, behaved exceptionally well, quietly drawing while Anne finished her tasks. Though physically identical, Ethan and Liam had distinct personalities. Ethan was methodical, precise in his drawings, while Liam worked more freely, his creations more expressive than accurate. Today, for some reason, they both seemed focused on a common goal. "What are you two drawing?" Anne asked as she passed through the kitchen to grab cleaning supplies. "It's a secret," Liam replied, strategically covering his drawing with his arm. Ethan nodded, equally mysterious. "It's for later." Anne smiled, leaving them to their secrets. She was just relieved to see them so well behaved, especially after the difficult day she'd had. When she finished her tasks and came back for them, she found the kitchen empty. For a moment, panic gripped her. "Ethan!" "Liam?" "Here, Mom!" Their voices came from the inner garden, accessible through a door off the kitchen. Anne let out a breath of relief when she found them crouched on the lawn, watching a small rabbit nibble at the grass near some bushes. "Look, Mom, a real rabbit!" "He's cute," Anne said, smiling at their excitement. "But we have to go now. I'm done for the day, and Mr. Carter should be home soon." The boys reluctantly said goodbye to the rabbit and returned to the kitchen to gather their drawings. Anne noticed they had made several, but one in particular caught her eye. A tall figure in a suit, clearly meant to be Thomas. "Did you draw Mr. Carter?" she asked, curious. Liam nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. We made him happy because he looked so sad." Anne felt a pang in her chest. Children's perception could be astounding. "That's very kind, kids. But we really need to go now. Can we leave the drawings for him?" Ethan asked. "Like a gift." Anne hesitated. After the photo incident, she wasn't sure Thomas would appreciate any personal gesture. But she couldn't deny her son's earnest request. "Okay, you can leave them on the table. I'm sure Alice will show him." The twins carefully stacked their drawings into a neat pile in the center of the table, with the portrait of Thomas on top. Anne noticed they'd written something on it, but she couldn't read it before Liam covered it with a blank sheet. "It's a surprise," the boy explained seriously. "He has to see it first." Anne nodded, stifling a smile. "Right. Let's head out before he arrives and spoils the surprise." Thomas arrived at the mansion later than usual that night. The investors' meeting had run long and he was exhausted. All he wanted was the refuge of his office, a glass of whiskey, and the temporary oblivion work provided. The house was quiet and dark, except for the soft light coming from the kitchen. Alice had probably left something for him to eat, as she always did when he arrived late. Entering the kitchen, he found a covered plate and noticed Alice had already turned in. Thomas helped himself to some food more out of necessity than appetite, and sat at the table. That's when he saw them, a stack of colorful papers. Curious, he lifted the first one. It was a child's drawing, clearly done by the twins, showing what appeared to be him alone with a serious expression. Next to it was a version of him smiling. An arrow pointed from the serious figure to the smiling one, and below it, in that childish handwriting he now recognized, was written, "Mr. Carter, happy is better." Thomas felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in so long he barely recognized it. It wasn't exactly joy nor exactly sorrow. It was more like longing. Longing for a time when smiling didn't hurt, when the idea of happiness didn't feel like a betrayal of everything he'd lost. He looked through the other drawings. One showed the mansion, but with colorful flowers in the garden. Another showed him and the twins, all holding hands. A third was just an explosion of bright colors guided with "For Mr. Carter to be happy" written at the bottom. Thomas stared at the drawings for a long time. He remembered how he had reacted the previous day when Anne accidentally broke the picture frame. His anger had been disproportionate, unfair. He knew it even as he yelled at her, but he couldn't contain it. Seeing that photo, Catherine smiling, James in her arms, his past self, a completely different man, had felt like a punch to the gut. And now, these drawings, created by children who barely knew him but, for some reason, wanted him to be happy. The simplicity of the gesture pierced something inside him, something he had kept sealed since the day of the accident. Without thinking too much, he tucked the drawings away. That night, as he tried to sleep, his mind drifted back to those bright pictures, those simple figures, and the sincere message, "Mr. Carter, happy is better." The words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he had tried to bury. Catherine smiling, James running around the garden. Himself, a different man, in a different time. For the first time in years, Thomas let himself think about what he had lost, not only with pain, but with something akin to gratitude for having experienced that happiness, however briefly. And for the first time in a long while, he fell asleep without resorting to whiskey, with the children's drawings still on his mind. The next morning, when Anne arrived at the mansion, she sensed something was different. She couldn't pinpoint what it was, but there was a subtle change in the air. It wasn't until she went into the kitchen that she noticed the twins' drawings were gone. Alice was preparing breakfast as usual, but there was something different about her expression. "Good morning, Ms. Walsh," the housekeeper said in a lighter tone than usual. "Mr. Carter woke up early today." "The drawings," Anne began, glancing at the now empty table. "He took them," Alice said with a small smile, "and he seemed different this morning." "Different how?" Alice appeared to consider the question. "He asked about your children. He wanted to know their names, how old they are. And he said if you need to bring them again, that's fine." Anne was surprised. After his explosive reaction the other day, the last thing she expected was for Thomas to be open to having children around the house. "There's more," Alice continued, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "He asked the gardener to rework the back garden. He wants colorful flowers planted. Said the house feels too lifeless." Anne didn't know what to say. Such a sudden, unexpected change. "Because of the drawings?" Alice shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe your children reminded him there's more to life than pain and work." The housekeeper returned to the stove. "Or maybe he was just waiting for a reason to start living again." Anne took in Alice's words silently. She began her work, thinking of the twins' colorful sketches and the impact they'd had. It was strange how tiny gestures could sometimes crack open walls that seemed impenetrable. The mansion's silence was still there, as it always would be. But now Anne heard something else, the distant echo of laughter that once filled those corridors, and the possibility, however faint, that someday it might return. Somehow, the mansion no longer felt quite so cold. The phone rang at 5:30 in the morning, tearing Anne out of a deep sleep. She groped in the dark, knocking over the alarm clock before finally finding the cell phone. "Hello?" she mumbled, her voice still thick with sleep. "Anne, I'm so sorry to call so early." Mrs. Porter's voice sounded weak and hoarse. "But I've had a terrible fever since last night. I can't watch the boys today." Anne sat up in bed, suddenly awake. "I'm sorry you're not feeling well. Get better soon. Don't worry about the boys, I'll figure something out." After hanging up, Anne stayed seated in the dark, her mind racing with possibilities. It was Monday, the start of the week, and she had no one to watch the twins. Her options were limited: skip work or take the kids with her. Neither seemed ideal. Missing work meant losing a day's pay, which would hurt at the end of the month. Besides, she'd already missed work twice in recent weeks for the boys' school events. She didn't want to give the impression she wasn't serious about the job. On the other hand, bringing Ethan and Liam to the Carter mansion. Anne remembered the last time the twins had been there, leaving drawings for Thomas. Though he seemed to have appreciated the gesture afterward, there was a big difference between liking children's drawings and tolerating their presence all day long. She looked at the clock. 6 o'clock. She had 2 hours to decide what to do. By the time the twins woke up, she'd made up her mind. As she prepared breakfast, she explained the situation. "Mrs. Porter is sick, so you'll have to come with me to work today." The boy's eyes lit up instantly. "We're going to the big house again." Liam nearly spilled his cereal in excitement. "Yes, but you have to behave very well. Mr. Carter is a busy man and doesn't like noise. You'll stay in the kitchen with Mrs. Grant while I work, and you can't leave there without permission. Understood?" "Yes, Mom," they replied in unison, though Anne could see the barely contained excitement in their eyes. To them, the mansion was like a mysterious castle, full of wonders to explore. Anne sighed, already anticipating the day's challenges. She grabbed a larger bag, filling it with coloring books, crayons, small toys, and extra snacks. If they had to stay confined to the kitchen all day, they'd need distractions. Arriving at the mansion was more tense than Anne expected. When the guard saw the twins, he hesitated before opening the gate, as though he needed permission first. "They're with me," Anne said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I have no one else to watch them today." After a brief radio exchange, the guard finally opened the gate. "Mrs. Grant has been notified," he said with a nod. Alice was waiting at the back door, her face impassive as ever. Anne immediately started explaining, "Alice, I'm so sorry, but Mrs. Porter is sick and I have no one else to watch them. I promise they won't get in the way. I brought things to keep them occupied and—" "It's all right, Mrs. Walsh," Alice interrupted, her expression softening a bit as she looked at the boys. "I already told Mr. Carter. He didn't object, as long as the children stay in the designated areas." Anne felt immense relief. "Thank you. Where should I put them?" "In the kitchen, like last time. If they need fresh air, they can use the indoor garden, but only with supervision." Anne nodded, grateful. She knelt in front of the boys, adjusting their jackets. "Remember what we talked about. Behave yourselves and listen to whatever Mrs. Grant says, okay?" "Yes, Mom," they replied, looking around with barely disguised curiosity. "Come on, kids," Alice said, extending her hand. "I have fresh cookies in the kitchen." Anne watched her sons walk off with the housekeeper, their small hands in hers, and silently prayed the day would pass without incident. Thomas was in his office when he heard it. Childish laughter, distant but unmistakable, floating through the corridors of the mansion like ghosts from a past he tried to forget. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. It hurt, and yet it felt strangely comforting. The first time Anne had brought the twins, he had been out. The second time, when they left those drawings, he'd only caught a quick glimpse of them upon arriving home. Today was different. They would be here all day, their voices and footsteps echoing through spaces left silent for years. Thomas set his pen down and stood up. He didn't plan to interact with the children, but he felt an inexplicable need to see them. Just a glimpse, he told himself, to know where they were and what they were doing. He followed the sound into the kitchen, stopping before reaching the doorway. Through the gap, he saw Alice cooking at the stove while the twins drew at the table. They were remarkably alike. Same light brown hair, same bright green eyes. Thomas tried to recall their names. Ethan and Liam, right? But which was which? He couldn't tell them apart. One of them, the more energetic one, suddenly looked up, as if sensing someone watching. Thomas backed away, but not fast enough. "Mr. Carter!" the boy exclaimed, jumping from his chair. "Hi!" Thomas froze, as Alice and the other twin turned to look at him too. He felt ridiculous, caught like a child spying. "Good morning," he finally said, stepping into the kitchen. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all, sir," Alice said quickly. "The boys are just drawing while I prepare lunch." The boy who had spotted him, Liam, Thomas assumed by his energy, smiled broadly. "Did you like our drawings, Mr. Carter?" he asked, no hint of shyness. Thomas blinked, surprised by the direct question. "Yes," he replied after a moment. "They were colorful." Liam laughed, as though Thomas had said something funny. Of course they were colorful. Sad drawings are black and white. Peculiar logic, Thomas thought, but it wasn't without its own sense. "What are you drawing now?" he asked, surprising even himself with his interest. Ethan, the quieter one, held up his paper. It was impressively detailed for a child that age, a drawing of the mansion from the outside, capturing many of its architectural features with care. "Your house," the boy explained softly. "It's really big." Thomas stepped closer for a better look. "That's a good observation," he commented, noticing how the boy had even included the columns of the main entrance. Not wanting to be outdone, Liam shoved his own drawing toward Thomas. It was quite different, an explosion of bright colors in which 3 figures could barely be distinguished, 2 small and 1 tall. "It's us playing in the garden," Liam explained. "Me, Ethan, and you." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "Me?" "Yes," Liam pointed to the taller figure. "You're showing us how to play ball." Thomas wasn't sure what to say. The idea was as absurd as it was painful. Him, playing with children in the garden, as if the last 3 years had never happened, as if he could still smile without feeling he was betraying the memory of his son. "That's quite an imagination," he managed at last, stepping back slightly. "I need to get back to work now." He turned to leave, but was stopped by Ethan's voice. "There are rabbits in your garden, Mr. Carter. We saw one last time." Thomas paused. "Yes, there are. They like the carrots the gardener plants." "Can we see them again?" Liam asked hopefully. Thomas hesitated. The sensible response was no. He had work, and the children were supposed to stay in the kitchen. Plenty of reasons to keep his distance. But something in the hopeful looks of the twins made the words come out differently than he intended. "Maybe after lunch, if the weather's nice." The boys lit up as though he'd offered them the most extraordinary gift. He gave a curt nod to Alice, who looked as surprised as he felt, and left the kitchen before he could change his mind. Anne was finishing cleaning the 3rd guest room when Alice came to find her. "Are the boys okay?" Anne asked immediately, worried something had happened. "They're fine," the housekeeper assured her. "They just finished lunch and are in the indoor garden now." Anne frowned. "Alone?" "No," Alice answered, with an expression Anne couldn't decipher. "Mr. Carter is with them." "What?" Anne nearly dropped the cleaning product she was holding. "Thomas is with my children." Alice nodded. "He stopped by the kitchen this morning, and they asked about the rabbits. He promised to show them the garden after lunch." Anne tried to process that. Thomas Carter, the man who barely spoke to her, who locked himself in his office, who'd exploded in anger over a photo, was voluntarily spending time with 2 5-year-olds. "I think I'd better go there," she said, setting her cleaning supplies aside. "There's no need," Alice replied calmly. "They're behaving wonderfully, and Mr. Carter seemed at ease." Anne wasn't convinced. "Even so, I'd prefer to check." She followed Alice to the indoor garden, a covered area in the mansion's center, shielded from the chilly fall wind. From a distance, she could hear the twins' excited voices. When she reached the glass door leading to the garden, she froze, surprised by the scene. Thomas was kneeling on the grass, pointing at something under a bush, while the twins leaned in, their heads nearly touching his. He spoke quietly, explaining something Anne couldn't make out from that distance. "He's showing them where the rabbits make their burrows," Alice whispered. "Apparently there's an entire family living in that corner of the garden for generations." Anne watched as her sons listened attentively, fascinated. Thomas gestured occasionally, indicating different parts of the garden, and the boys nodded, soaking up every word. There was no tension in his shoulders, no discomfort in his posture. For the first time since she'd met him, Thomas Carter looked natural. "Maybe we should leave them be," Alice suggested gently. "We still have the 2nd floor to finish." Anne hesitated, torn between curiosity to watch and fear of interrupting. Finally, she nodded and followed Alice back to work, casting one last glance at the trio in the garden. Thomas hadn't planned on spending so much time with the twins. He meant only to show them where the rabbits lived and return to his office. But the kids' endless questions kept him there, explaining the rabbits' habits, the different plants, and eventually the mansion's history. "Is this house really old?" Ethan asked, gazing at the imposing structure around them. "Quite old," Thomas replied. "My great-grandfather built it over 100 years ago." 100 years? Liam exclaimed, eyes wide. "That's older than Grandma." Thomas couldn't help a slight smile. "Significantly older, yes." "Have you always lived here?" Ethan asked, curious. The question made Thomas hesitate. "No. I lived elsewhere when I was younger. I moved back here after a few years ago." Liam, sensing the change in Thomas's tone, shifted the subject with the quick adaptability children possess. "Look, there's the rabbit again." A small brown rabbit had ventured out from the bushes, eyeing the trio warily. Thomas signaled the boys to stay still. "If you don't move or speak loudly, it'll come closer," he said in a near whisper. The twins instantly obeyed, going still like statues. Encouraged by their stillness, the rabbit hopped closer, sniffing the air. "Does it have a name?" Liam whispered, not taking his eyes off the animal. "I don't think so," Thomas replied. "But you can give it one if you want." "How about Fluffy?" Liam decided instantly. Ethan rolled his eyes. "That's a dog's name." "Is not." "Yes, it is." "Quiet," Thomas warned, but not harshly. "You'll scare Fluffy." The boys fell silent, though they exchanged surprised looks at Thomas using the suggested name. The rabbit kept nibbling, inching closer until it was less than a yard away. That's when Thomas slowly took out some lettuce leaves from his pocket. He'd grabbed them in the kitchen and laid them on the grass. The rabbit sniffed the air, judging the risk for a moment, then hopped carefully toward the food. The twins held their breath, watching the animal eat, its little jaws working quickly. "He likes us," Ethan whispered in awe. "He likes lettuce," Thomas corrected gently. "But yes, he trusts us enough to eat here." They stayed like that for a few minutes in reverent silence, watching the rabbit finish its snack and hop back into the bushes. Only then did the boys exhale and burst into excited chatter. Thomas stood, dusting off his knees. "We should go back inside. Your mother might be worried." "Can we see the rabbits again tomorrow?" Liam asked hopefully. The question caught Thomas off guard. He hadn't considered the children returning to the mansion. "Are you coming back tomorrow too?" "I'm not sure," Ethan replied, more attuned to reality. "It depends on whether Mrs. Porter is still sick." Thomas nodded, uncertain what to say. Part of him hoped the babysitter recovered quickly so his routine could return to normal, free of noisy interruptions. Another part, one he didn't want to acknowledge, felt a strange anticipation at the thought of their return. "Well, if you do come," he finally said, "I think Fluffy would appreciate another visit." The smiles he received in return were dazzling, reminding him of another smile, from another time, which he kept carefully locked away in his memory. The resemblance made his chest ache, but differently than usual, not just with the sharp pain of loss, but with something more complex, something akin to gratitude for this unexpected moment of connection. Dawn's faint light filtered through the kitchen windows as Anne brewed coffee. She had arrived earlier than usual, hoping to finish some pending tasks before picking up the twins from Mrs. Porter's. The past few weeks had created a routine that, while exhausting, worked well. 3 days a week, the boys stayed with the sitter, and on the other 2 they came to the mansion with her. Thomas hadn't objected to the new arrangement. In fact, after that first afternoon in the garden with the rabbits, he almost seemed to welcome the twins' visits. Anne noticed how he would accidentally pass by the rooms where the boys were, how he sometimes left his office door ajar when they played in the hallway, how he occasionally joined them for a few minutes before retreating with some excuse about work. It was a strange dance that Anne watched in silence. Thomas clearly enjoyed the children's presence, yet maintained a careful distance, as if he were afraid to get too close. "You came early today." Alice's voice interrupted her thoughts as the housekeeper entered the kitchen, impeccably dressed despite the hour. "I wanted to get a head start on cleaning the ground floor," Anne explained. "The twins are coming today, and I always take more time when they're around." Alice nodded, pouring herself some coffee. "They bring life to this house," she commented with a rare smile. "I never thought I'd see these walls echo with children's laughter again." Anne hesitated, clutching her cup with both hands. "Alice," she began, unsure if she should ask the question that had been bothering her for weeks. What happened to Mr. Carter's family? The housekeeper fell silent for so long that Anne thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with sadness. It was 3 years ago, a car accident. Alice stared out the window, as though seeing the past reflected there. Mr. Carter was on a business trip. Catherine decided to take James to meet him, make it a surprise. It was Thomas's birthday. Anne felt a lump form in her throat. His son, James, Alice continued, was 5 years old, the same age as your twins. She paused, apparently deciding how much to reveal. It happened on a mountain road in the rain. The car skidded on a curve and went off an embankment. Catherine died instantly. James survived for a few hours at the hospital. Long enough for Thomas to arrive and say goodbye. Anne closed her eyes, imagining her own boys so full of life, and the thought of losing them was unbearable. Thomas changed completely after that, Alice said. He sold the house they lived in, closed his city office and isolated himself here. This mansion has always been in the Carter family, but they only came for vacations. He turned it into a fortress, a place to hide from the world and the memories. So that's why, Anne couldn't finish. Why he reacts the way he does, Alice said, completing Anne's thought. Yes, that picture you accidentally broke, that was their last photo together. Taken a day before the accident at an amusement park. Anne swallowed hard, recalling Thomas's explosive rage, which now made painful sense. I never imagined. Nobody does, Alice said with a sigh. People see the successful businessman, the cold, distant man. They don't see the father and husband destroyed by loss. She paused, then added, he hadn't interacted with children since James, until your boys came along. That explains why he looks so uncomfortable sometimes, Anne murmured, mostly to herself. Uncomfortable isn't the right word, Alice corrected. He's afraid. Afraid? Afraid of caring again. Of feeling again. Alice met Anne's eyes. When you lose someone you love so tragically, the pain is unbearable. Some people cope by refusing to love again. That's what he's been doing. Anne pondered Alice's words as she finished her coffee. Everything now made sense. The long silences, the mansion's emptiness, the reaction to the photo, and especially the way Thomas interacted with the twins, a mix of fascination and withdrawal, like someone approaching a fire knowing it might burn. Why are you telling me this now? Anne asked at last. Alice got up and took her cup to the sink. Because your children awakened something in him, something I thought was gone forever. She turned to Anne. And because I think you need to understand what's happening, for the boy's sake. And for his. Thomas watched from his office window as Anne arrived with the twins. Even from a distance, he could see their excitement, the way they bounced alongside their mother. Liam, always the more exuberant, pointed at the sky, probably commenting on the clouds that hinted at snow. Ethan, quieter, held Anne's hand firmly, but his eyes roamed the garden, maybe searching for rabbits. An involuntary smile tugged at Thomas's lips before he could repress it. Over the past few weeks, he'd grown used to the twins being around the mansion. They brought a sort of organized chaos he surprisingly didn't mind. In fact, he sometimes caught himself looking forward to their arrival, and that frightened him deeply. Last week, he'd shown Ethan his collection of miniature cars kept in a display case in the library. The boy's genuine interest, the careful way he handled each piece, the barrage of clever questions, all of it briefly transported Thomas to another time, with another boy, equally curious, equally gentle. For a moment, he forgot the pain, and immediately afterward, guilt had hit him like a punch in the stomach. How could he allow himself these moments of joy when James would never grow, learn or live again? How could he feel fondness for other children when his own son lay beneath a cold headstone? Thomas turned away from the window, determined to keep his distance today. He had several conference calls scheduled, reports to review, emails to answer. Legitimate reasons to stay locked in his office, away from the temptation to smile again, to feel again. Anne noticed the shift in Thomas's behavior as soon as they entered the mansion. Normally, he found some excuse to pass through the kitchen when they arrived, checking the coffee, asking Alice a question, retrieving a forgotten document. Today, there was no sign of him. The twins noticed him too. During lunch, Liam asked, "Is Mr. Carter not coming today?" Anne exchanged a look with Alice. "He's probably busy, honey. He has a lot of work to do." "But he said he'd show me more toy cars," Ethan murmured, disappointed. "Maybe another day," Anne said, trying to sound positive. After lunch, while the children colored at the kitchen table, Anne resumed her tasks. Walking through the hallway toward Thomas's office, she noticed the door was firmly closed, unlike the previous days when it was left ajar. She hesitated, wondering if she should knock. Alice's revelations that morning still echoed in her mind, giving her new insight into the man behind that door. He wasn't just a distant, temperamental boss. He was someone deeply wounded, trying to guard what little remained of himself. She decided to respect his space. Thomas needed to face his own ghosts in his own time. Pushing him to confront his pain wouldn't help anyone. When she returned to the kitchen, she found the twins restless. "Can we look for Mr. Carter?" Liam asked, hopping off his chair. "I want to show him my new drawing." "No, sweetheart. He's working and can't be disturbed." "But he always looks at our drawings," Ethan argued. Anne sighed, unsure how to explain. "Sometimes people need time alone, even if they like us." "It's not that Mr. Carter doesn't want to see you, he's just busy." The boys seemed to process her words, though they remained unconvinced. Anne suggested a walk in the indoor garden, hoping they might spot Fluffy and his family again. The mention of rabbits distracted them for the moment, but Anne noticed how they kept glancing hopefully toward the house, as if expecting Thomas to appear. From his second-floor bedroom window, Thomas watched Anne and the twins in the garden. Ethan knelt by a bush, probably looking for signs of rabbits, while Liam ran in circles, trying to catch falling leaves. Anne supervised with a patient smile, occasionally adjusting the children's jackets against the cold. It was a simple, everyday scene, but it made Thomas's chest tighten painfully. He remembered similar afternoons with Catherine and James, the laughter, the small discoveries, the sense of complete belonging he had never felt again. He closed his eyes, trying to chase away the memories, but they came anyway. James at 4, fascinated by a butterfly perched on his finger, Catherine snapping pictures with her old camera, her face aglow with happiness. Thomas himself, feeling like the luckiest man in the world, unaware that in less than a year everything would be lost. When he opened his eyes, he saw Liam looking toward the mansion straight at his window. The boy smiled and waved enthusiastically upon seeing him. Before he could think, Thomas raised his hand in a slight wave, then pulled back into the shadows of the room. His heart pounded. As though he'd done something forbidden, it was just a wave, he told himself. A simple gesture of acknowledgement. It meant nothing. But he knew that was a lie. In the past few weeks, something had changed inside him. The twins' presence at the mansion had reawakened feelings he thought he'd lost forever. Curiosity, lightness, even fleeting moments of joy. It was as if someone had opened a window in a long closed room, letting in fresh air and light. And that terrified him, because he knew better than anyone the price of love, the price of letting people into your heart, only to lose them brutally. The pain of losing Catherine and James had nearly destroyed him. He wouldn't survive another loss like that. He couldn't allow himself to care about Anne and her children. He couldn't risk forming bonds that would inevitably break. People always leave one way or another. They go away, they die, they disappear, and the emptiness they leave behind is unbearable. Thomas returned to his office, determined to keep his distance. It was best for everyone. He needed to remind the twins that he was just the mansion's owner, their mother's employer, nothing more. Anything else would be too dangerous. As Anne finished for the day and prepared to leave with the twins, Alice appeared with a wooden box. "Mr. Carter asked me to give this to the boys," she said, handing over the box. Anne took it, surprised. It was old, with delicate carvings along the sides. "What is it?" Liam asked eagerly. Anne opened the lid, revealing a set of antique lead soldiers, perfectly preserved, each one hand-painted with impressive detail. "They're very special toys," Alice explained, giving Anne a meaningful look. "They belong to Mr. Carter when he was a child." The twins' eyes widened at the treasure. "He's giving them to us," Ethan asked, incredulous. "Lending them," Alice corrected, "for you to play with when you're here." Anne understood what wasn't being said. Thomas hadn't appeared all day, deliberately keeping his distance. But this gift, well, loan, was his way of saying the boys were still welcome, even if he couldn't bring himself to be with them. "Thank you, Alice," Anne said, carefully closing the box. "We'll take good care of them, won't we, boys?" The twins nodded solemnly, intuitively grasping the significance of the gesture. As they walked to the bus stop, Anne glanced back at the imposing mansion. Somewhere inside, a man was wrestling with his own demons, trying to find a balance between protecting himself from pain and allowing himself to live again. There was nothing she could do to help him fight that battle, except respect his process and his boundaries. Thomas had to find his own path through the darkness, but maybe, just maybe, 2 5-year-olds had already started lighting the way without realizing it. The rain had been falling non-stop for 2 days, turning the mansion's garden into a small maze of puddles. Thomas stood by his office window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The grey sky reflected his mood, not exactly melancholy but contemplative, as though he were on the verge of an important decision. The past few weeks had been strange. After trying to pull back, avoiding the twins, Thomas found that they simply refused to be ignored. Not in an intrusive or disobedient way, they were always polite and respectful, but there was a persistence in their innocent outlook that cut through all the barriers he tried to build. Ethan left careful drawings under his office door, pictures of the mansion's landscape, impressively accurate sketches of the garden rabbits, and even imaginary scenes where a tall man in a suit played with 2 small children. Liam was more direct. "Mr. Carter, are you still sad at us?" he'd asked a few days ago, catching Thomas off guard in the hallway. That simple, devastating question had gone unanswered, with Thomas mumbling something about work before hurrying away. But the truth was, he wasn't sad at them. He was afraid of what they represented, the possibility of caring again, of opening himself up to happiness and, inevitably, to the pain that came with it. A sudden ray of sunshine broke through the clouds, briefly lighting up the garden. The rain was letting up, and Thomas noticed how the puddles reflected the sky like little mirrors scattered across the lawn. It was almost beautiful. Then he heard it, laughter, bright and unconstrained, coming from the back garden. He checked the time, surprised to see it was already past 5. Anne should be wrapping up her shift, and usually the twins stayed in the kitchen with Alice by this hour. Driven by curiosity he couldn't suppress, Thomas left his office and followed the sound. He crossed the main corridor and stepped out through a side door that led directly to the garden. The rain had stopped completely, and the air smelled fresh, that particular scent of wet earth. The laughter came from behind a large oak tree, where the garden sloped slightly downward. Thomas approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. As he drew closer, he saw Anne sitting on a stone bench, watching the twins playing a few feet away. The boys were fully absorbed in their activity, crouched in the damp soil, digging with little plastic spades Thomas didn't recognize, probably brought from home. They were absolutely filthy, their clothes muddy and their faces speckled with dirt, but their smiles were radiant. "Look, Ethan, I found another one," Liam exclaimed, holding up something Thomas couldn't make out from this distance. "Let me see." Ethan scooted over, examining the object intently. "It's just like mine." Anne observed them with a tired but genuine smile. Thomas wondered how many hours she'd worked that day, how many sleepless nights she'd spent worrying about the boys, the bills, and an uncertain future. "What did you find over there, detectives?" she asked, leaning forward. "Treasure!" Liam cried enthusiastically. "The rain made them show up." Now Thomas took a few more steps, genuinely intrigued. That's when Ethan turned, holding up his treasure for his mother to see. The world seemed to freeze. In the boy's small, muddy hand was a toy car, not a modern plastic one, but a metal miniature, hand-painted, a red Jaguar E-Type, an old model, a collector's item Thomas knew very well. Without realizing it, Thomas stepped closer, moving out of the oak tree's shadow. Anne saw him first, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "Mr. Carter," she said, standing up, "I'm sorry, we were just about to leave. The rain stopped, and the boys wanted some fresh air before—" Thomas barely heard her. His eyes were glued to the car in Ethan's hand. The boy noticed his gaze and held it out to him. "Look what we found, Mr. Carter." "It was buried right there," he explained, pointing to a spot where the ground had been washed out by the rain. "There are more of them." Thomas approached slowly, as if hypnotized, and took the car. The red paint was slightly faded, with patches of mud, but it was unmistakable. He could even see on the underside the initials JC drawn in permanent marker. "James Carter," he whispered, so softly no one heard. Liam came closer, holding two more cars, a green Aston Martin and a blue Ford Mustang. "We found these, too, Mr. Carter. Are they yours?" Thomas felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like thick ice finally cracking after a long winter. "They belong to my son," he said, surprised by the clarity of his own voice. He loved toy cars. A silence fell over the group. Anne put her hands on the twins' shoulders, as if wanting to protect them from a potential outburst. But Thomas felt strangely calm. "He buried them here one summer," he continued, eyes still on the little red Jaguar. "I said he was making a treasure for the future. I completely forgot." "What was his name?" Ethan asked gently. "James," Thomas replied, letting the boy's name pass his lips for the first time in a long while. "He was 5, just like you." The twins exchanged a look, one of those silent communications only they seemed to understand. Then, simultaneously, they took a step forward, still holding the other toy cars. "Do you want them back?" Liam asked, offering the cars. That question, so simple and direct, spoken without fear or hesitation, hit Thomas in a way he didn't expect. He looked at the cars, then at the boys' faces waiting for his reply, and something shifted inside him. "No," he finally said. "I think James would be happy you found them." The smiles on the twins' faces were like sunlight breaking through dense clouds. Thomas felt his lips curve up in response, a movement so unfamiliar after all this time that it felt odd. He glanced at Anne, who watched with teary eyes. "It's getting late," he said unexpectedly. "Why don't you all come inside for some hot chocolate before you go? I think we all deserve it after this rainy day." That evening, after Anne and the twins left, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stayed in his office, holding that little red Jaguar, spinning it in his hand occasionally so the light caught on its worn paint. Memories he had locked away for years flooded back, not with the overwhelming pain of before, but with a bittersweet feeling that was almost comforting. James burying treasure in the garden, Catherine laughing and taking pictures with her old camera, the three of them, a family, living, loving, existing together. The pain of losing them would never vanish entirely, Thomas knew. But perhaps, just perhaps, it didn't have to be the only thing left. He looked at a small stack of documents on his desk, information he had discreetly gathered over the past few weeks about private schools in the area. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity. But now, holding James's toy car that bridged past and present, he admitted the truth. He was worried about Anne's twins. He saw how hard she worked to give them her best, juggling every penny. He saw the boys' potential, Ethan's keen, observant intelligence, Liam's vibrant creativity, and wondered what would happen to such gifts in a world where opportunities weren't always fair. Thomas picked up one of the brochures, Westbrook Academy, a renowned school known for its scholarship programs for talented children. They had assured him that, with his influence, 2 spots could be arranged for the next semester, even though it was outside the normal enrollment period. He placed James's car carefully beside the brochure and, for the first time in 3 years, made a decision that didn't involve hiding from the world, but stepping back into it. "Mr. Carter wants to see us." "Both of us?" Anne could hardly conceal her surprise when Alice delivered the message the next morning. "Yes, in his office, as soon as possible," the housekeeper confirmed, wearing a small smile Anne couldn't decipher. "Did I do something wrong?" Anne asked nervously. Despite the recent moments of apparent connection, Thomas Carter was still her boss, and his behavior was unpredictable at best. "I don't believe so," Alice replied. "Actually, he seemed different this morning." "Different how?" "Lighter, in a way I haven't seen in a long time." Intrigued and slightly anxious, Anne put her cleaning supplies aside and headed to the office. The twins trailed behind her quietly, Ethan holding one of the toy cars they'd found the previous day, now cleaned up carefully, and Liam alternating between skipping and small hops. Thomas received them with a formality that felt slightly forced, as though he were trying to maintain a distance he no longer truly wished to keep. He motioned for them to sit in the chairs in front of his desk. "The cars are clean now, Mr. Carter," Liam announced, breaking the awkward silence. "Mom helped us get all the dirt off." "Yes," Anne confirmed, blushing a little. "I hope you don't mind. We thought it was a shame to leave them dirty, since they're so nice." Thomas looked at the cars in the twins' hands and nodded. "You did a good job. James would have—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Thank you." Anne noticed that, unlike before, he no longer avoided saying his son's name. It was a small but significant detail. Thomas cleared his throat, taking on a more businesslike tone. "I asked you here because I have a proposal." He opened a folder and pushed some colorful brochures across the desk toward Anne. "Have you heard of Westbrook Academy?" Anne picked up the brochures, confused, only by reputation. "It's one of the best private schools in the region, but—" She didn't finish, but completely out of our reach hung in the air. "They have an excellent program for children ages 5 to 6, focusing on discovery and developing individual talents," Thomas continued, as if he hadn't noticed her hesitation. "Small classes, highly qualified teachers, top-notch facilities." "It looks wonderful," Anne said slowly, still not grasping his point. "But why are you showing me this?" Thomas took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into unknown waters. "I'd like to offer full scholarships for Ethan and Liam at Westbrook Academy." A shocked silence followed. The twins glanced between their mother and Thomas, sensing the importance of the moment but not fully understanding. "I don't understand," Anne finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's quite straightforward. I have connections at the school and enough influence to secure 2 spots. All costs would be covered: tuition, uniforms, supplies, transportation. They could start next semester." "But why?" The question slipped out before Anne could stop it. Thomas briefly glanced at the cars in the twins' hands, then back at Anne. "Because they deserve the best education possible. Because they have potential that shouldn't be wasted. Because—" He hesitated, then continued in a quieter voice, "because they brought something back to this house that I thought was lost forever." Anne felt tears welling up, but held them back. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Carter, but I can't accept. It's too much." "It's not charity, if that's what worries you," Thomas said quickly. "Think of it as an investment in the future, or a way of thanking them for everything they've done without even realizing it." "What did we do?" Ethan asked, confused. Thomas looked at the boy, a tentative smile forming. "You helped me remember there's still life after loss, that there can still be joy, even when we think it's all gone." Anne was at a loss for words. The transformation in Thomas was almost palpable. The harsh lines of his face were softer, his posture less rigid. The cold, distant man she'd met months ago was slowly giving way to someone capable of vulnerability and connection. "Can we at least think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course," Thomas said, "but don't take too long. The semester starts in 3 weeks, and there are some preparations to be made." Leaving the office, Anne was still in a daze. The offer was more than she'd ever dreamed for her children, an opportunity that would completely change their lives, opening doors usually closed to kids in their situation. "Mom," Liam said, tugging her hand, "can we go to that new school?" "I don't know, honey. It's a big decision. But Mr. Carter wants to help us," Ethan said sensibly, "and you always say we shouldn't refuse help when it's offered sincerely." Anne smiled, amazed by her son's simple wisdom. "You're right. We'll think about it carefully, okay?" 3 weeks later, Thomas waited in the mansion's main hall, checking his watch periodically. He wore his usual formal suit, but something about him looked different. Maybe his hair was more carefully combed, or his tie chosen with extra care. When Anne arrived with the twins, he almost didn't recognize them. Dressed in Westbrook Academy's navy blue uniforms, neatly pressed pants, crisp white shirts, tiny ties, and blazers with the school crest, They suddenly looked older, more serious. "Look, Mr. Carter!" Liam exclaimed, spinning around to show off the full uniform. "We're as fancy as you." Thomas gave a genuine smile, something that now came more easily. "You look very sharp." "Real gentleman." Ethan, typically more reserved, seemed a bit nervous, gripping his mother's hand tightly. "What if they don't like us?" he whispered, glancing anxiously at Anne. It was Thomas who answered, kneeling to the boy's eye level. "They'll love you, and if someone doesn't, that's their problem, not yours. Never forget that." Anne watched, her heart clenching at the gentle way Thomas spoke to Ethan, the care in his words, the way he soothed the boy without belittling his worries. It was a side of him that rarely showed, but it was appearing more often in recent weeks. "It's time," Thomas announced, standing up. "My driver will take us." "You're coming with us?" Liam asked, both surprised and delighted. "If your mother doesn't mind," Thomas said, glancing at Anne with a quietly unsure expression. "I thought I'd be there for their first day." Anne nodded, touched by the gesture. "Of course. We'd be honored." The drive to the school was filled with the twins' excited questions, which Thomas answered patiently. He knew a lot of details about Westbrook Academy, having done extensive research. Anne noticed his meticulous side, typical of him. When they arrived at the imposing school gates, Anne felt a brief moment of panic. Everything about this place screamed privilege and status, worlds away from her own life. Other parents stepped out of luxury cars, dressed impeccably, as if attending a social event rather than dropping off their kids. "Don't worry," Thomas said quietly, noticing her expression. "They have every right to be here, just like any other student." Inside, they were greeted personally by the principal, an honor Anne suspected not every new student received, likely due to Thomas's influence. The elegantly dressed woman gave them a tour of the impressive facilities, spacious classrooms, science labs, art studios, a library that looked like something from a fairy tale. The twins' eyes were wide with excitement and a bit of apprehension. When it was time to say goodbye, both hugged Anne tightly, promising to behave and do their best. What Anne didn't expect was to see them turn to Thomas afterward, hesitating for a moment before hugging him too. The shock on his face was brief, replaced by a warm expression as he returned the hug, awkwardly but sincerely. "We'll see you later," he promised. "And I want to hear everything about your first day." As Anne and Thomas watched the boys follow their teacher into the classroom, Anne finally let the tears she'd been holding back slip free. Thomas silently offered her a handkerchief, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "They'll be fine," he said, more to himself than to her. "Yes, they will," she agreed, dabbing her eyes. "Thanks to you." Thomas shook his head. "No. They would have made it somehow sooner or later. They're extraordinary children, Anne." It was the first time he used her first name, and neither missed the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "I have another proposal," Thomas said as they headed back to the car. "There's a lot of empty space in the mansion. Rooms no one uses, an entire wing practically abandoned." He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "I'd like you and the boys to consider moving in there." Anne stopped, staring at him. "What?" "You'd have complete privacy, a set of rooms on the second floor with a separate entrance if you prefer. The boys would have room to play, to study. You'd be closer to the school, and transportation would be easier." He spoke quickly, as though afraid of being interrupted. "And I'd appreciate the company." Anne was speechless. The offer was totally unexpected, yet somehow felt like a logical next step in this strange journey that began months ago when the twins offered a hug to a sad man. "You don't have to answer right now," Thomas went on. "Think about it. Talk to the boys." Anne nodded, still absorbing it. "I will," she promised. During the drive back to the mansion, she kept glancing at Thomas. He seemed different, not just in posture or the occasional smile that no longer looked so foreign. There was something deeper, an emerging peace replacing the constant sorrow she used to see in his eyes. She thought of the twins in their new uniforms, stepping into a world of possibilities she could never have provided alone. She thought of Thomas's offer, the chance at a different life, not just for her boys, but for her as well. The future, which had always seemed so limited, now stretched out like a book full of blank pages waiting to be written. For the first time in years, Anne allowed herself to imagine possibilities that once felt like distant dreams. The Carter mansion, once a symbol of grief and isolation, now offered a different promise, a new beginning, of healing connections, of a family finding its way from pain to something that, if not exactly happiness, at least resembled peace. And maybe, Anne thought as she gazed out the car window at the clear morning sky, that was enough for now. They would figure out the rest together,